When I was a young kid, a bit over 10 years old, I fell in love with photography. It being the late 1970s, we're talking film photography, of course, which I used to shoot on a little Instamatic camera. Thrilled by my early results and quickly addicted to the possibilities of photography, I decided that Boots the Chemist was far too expensive and I wanted to make my own prints. While my friends experimented with huffing industrial solvent and vandalising the council estate playground, I got into a different kind of chemical. I spent some Christmas money on a second-hand enlarger and some developing equipment that would process my own black and white photos in the family bathroom. It was not the ideal environment to process photographs, particularly since my light proofing consisted of putting a family bath towel in front of the bathroom window. But black and white film development is more forgiving than colour, and actually my prints came out okay. Initially, my photographs were street shots of a neighbourhood just off of London where I grew up. They still hadn't redeveloped pockets of land that the Nazis bombed 30 years previous, and there were plenty of illicit locations that I found visually interesting. Later, as I entered the nobody understands my sorrowful perception and misery-fueled soul blunder years, I started taking moody photographs of myself or moody, angst-ridden friends being moody in moody locations. All of those early experimental photographs went missing somewhere between my college years and my first job. My parents said they never threw anything out, but all of my photos and negatives neatly collected in ring-bound files were lost. Who knows, maybe decades after I snuff it, they'll turn up like some post-punk Cockney street urchin Vivian Meyer garage sale discovery, and the art world will be awestruck by my ability to channel the nihilism of English suburbia simply by walking purposefully down council estate pavements in a black bomber jacket. So yeah, I started young, but I wasn't always taking photographs. In fact, I took most of my 20s off to do a bit of living, if you know what I mean. There aren't many photographs with a 1990s date stamp in my archives, and honestly, that's undoubtedly a good thing. But at the time, I was a games and technology journalist, and that meant that I was amongst the first wave of people to have access to digital camera technology. All that first generation digital camera tech, Ixus range and the power shots. I even got to test the first Micro Four Thirds camera, the Panasonic Lumix G1. Access to that technology was more than enough to rekindle my love affair with photography, and I invested once more in my own camera gear. Fortunately for me, by then I was living in the southwest of England, initially in Georgian Bath, and then a bit later a small town in the Cotswolds. People travel from all over the world to visit, experience and to photograph the Cotswolds, and as a freelance journalist at that stage I was working from home and therefore able to get out and about with my camera and photograph it all. It was of course a very different environment to the one my photographic journey began in. The almost sickeningly cute Cotswold stone cottages and rolling Cotswold hills were a great, if undynamic, subject. I remember reflecting at the time that my angst-ridden early photographs, poor misunderstood teenage me, would have looked ridiculous against the Dickensian Christmas card backdrop of the Cotswolds. Those nihilist proto-selfies were awful, but at least they only looked pretentious and awkward thanks to a backdrop of brutalist 1970s architecture and piss-stinking shopping centre doorways. But if I'd taken them in the Cotswold town we made our home, they'd have looked like either catalogue shots for a budget range from a post-war British high street clothing retailer, or promotional shots for Out and About, the town council's free monthly magazine. You try looking edgy, angst-ridden and misunderstood in Bourton-on-the-Water. My point being, the environment we find ourselves in doesn't just affect what we photograph, it affects the context we're trying to illuminate. Context is everything. That was a key that helped open the door to photography for me and to better understand what I'd apparently been trying to say with every press of the shutter button. Once you understand how something works, then you can begin playing with the rules that underpin it. I don't want to disappear completely up my own backside with pretentious analogies, but it honestly was like something of a Matrix moment, seeing the code underneath the real world. I started thinking about that context every time I took a photograph. My photography still sucked, but now I had a better idea why, and I realised that the only way I was going to get better at it was to take a lot of photographs, like lots more. You know the saying, if you can't tie knots, tie lots? The same applies to photography. If you can't take shots, take lots. When I look back at those photographs, I realised that whilst they mostly suck, I did subconsciously know which direction I was heading in, and I can see the first signs of what I will generously call my style. They say that gear doesn't matter, and that's partially true. Gear doesn't matter once you reach a baseline of quality. An iPhone 6 obviously can't compete with a Nikon Z9. The introduction of RAW to digital cameras certainly changed things for me. The first camera I ever owned that had RAW capabilities was a Canon PowerShot G6. I loved that little point and shoot with its massive 7-megapixel sensor, and I took it everywhere with me. When I bought it back in 2004, I chanced on the RAW file option by accident when I was absent-mindedly clicking through the camera's settings one day. After disappearing down a Google rabbit hole, I discovered that RAW effectively compensated for some of my deficiencies as a photographer, recovering blown-out highlights when I'd overexposed and heavy shadow when I'd underexposed. So, years before I moved to the other side of the planet, the introduction of the RAW file format and my use of it in my photography made me look a slightly better photographer, even if I wasn't. I was taking more photographs now and editing them in Photoshop, but I didn't have an easily defined style, and many of my photos from that era have a snapshot feel to them. When I look at them now, I can see that I was finding it difficult to translate what I pictured in my head versus what I was photographing with the camera, and it's entirely possible that I'd still be struggling to take anything more than snapshots had fate not decided to deliver me to somewhere about as far removed from the Cotswolds as it's possible to get. In 2004, me, my wife Catherine and our 3-year-old son Josh flew out to spend 3 weeks in Australia with my parents, who had retired down under 8 years previously. We all felt strangely immediately at home. We fell in love with the place, and we'd started making plans to move there before we even touched back down at drizzly Heathrow. My dad is Australian, and that meant I qualified for Australian citizenship, so we had no visa issues. We bought a house in South Coast, New South Wales, a couple of hours south of Sydney, and settled into our new lives. By now, I had progressed from bridge cameras to DSLRs, and began exploring this part of the world, taking photographs wherever I went. I'll freely admit that I turned into a true photography tragic, chasing colourful sunrises and sunsets, lookouts, cliff tops, caves and bush tracks whenever I could. There was no doubt that the quality of my photographs had improved after arriving in Australia. I was shooting more consistently, and I had definitely developed a style of sorts. The new and better camera helped, of course, but the images I was producing were far removed from those I was taking in the scenic Cotswolds. Which brings us back to the subject of this video. Did moving to Australia make me a better photographer? The answer to that question is a qualified yes. But the reasons are more complex than simply being in this admittedly magical country. I think I could have become as proficient at photography as I am now in the UK, but it probably would have been a slower process. The reason for that comes down to 4 things: opportunity, aspiration, motivation, and yes, weather. This part of Australia is one of the most scenic in the whole country. It's not as dramatic or rugged in the sense that Kakadu National Park is, And it doesn't have that horizon to horizon feeling of space you get in the outback, but it is beautiful and varied in a way I haven't experienced anywhere else here. That's the opportunity part of the equation. I can drive for 45 minutes south and be on a pristine white sand beach where the bush stretches down to the crystal clear turquoise ocean like a tropical island. I can drive 45 minutes southwest and be in the officially designated wilderness of Moreton National Park, which is larger than the whole of Greater London and scarcely heard of outside the local communities. I can drive 45 minutes due west and be in the Southern Highlands, part of the Great Dividing Range, and exploring plunging canyons, cascades and waterfalls. The variety of locations and the diversity of environments means that I can enjoy pretty much all kinds of landscape photography within a 100-kilometre radius of my house. Woodland, rainforest, hills, seascape, river, pastoral, coastal, surf, reef, waterfall and lake. Hell, if I keep driving southwest for a couple of hours, I can add snowfields and mountains to the list. Oh, and since the light pollution levels here are so low, you can add astrophotography to that list too. We even get Antarctic aurora this far north occasionally. Being in locations as glorious as the ones in this region makes me want to do better. It makes me strive to capture these scenes as well as I possibly can and to do justice to them. That's the aspiration part of the equation. When I'm standing somewhere like the cliff edges at Drawing Room Rocks, looking south down the coast towards Jervis Bay and inland towards Kangaroo Valley, I want to record that location visually to the best of my ability. I aspire to photograph a location such that someone viewing it would feel that I've captured its essence. That might mean revisiting these locations again and again, and that's the motivation part of the equation. There's something about the possibilities of the landscape here that make it easier for me to motivate myself to go out and photograph it. If I was still living in the Cotswolds or Bath or even, God forbid, North London, I would be fairly restricted to specific kinds of photography and generic locations in my backyard. When I grow a bit bored of one kind of environment, I can switch to a different one. I might suddenly feel the urge to photograph waterfalls, perhaps at a different time of day or perhaps at night. There are so many possibilities that I find it easier not to slip into routine, though, and I'm being honest here, it does still happen. That brings us around to that final part of the equation, the weather. And look, I'm from the UK, the land of drizzle. I strongly believe that grey skies and drizzle are the reason we Brits are the way we are. If you can cope with day after day of grey skies and drizzle without losing your shit, then you can cope with anything. That British weather, created in part by the British Isles' proximity to the warm ocean current known as the Gulf Stream, is the reason Brits relax so hard on the annual holiday to Spain. The vastly superior weather here in the south coast of New South Wales on the eastern Pacific side of the country has definitely changed my photography. But above and beyond the warmer year-round temperatures and far more predictable weather cycles, there's something of a microclimate in this exact location, which means that if it's raining here, the odds are it's fine 10 k's away at the coast. I don't mind looking at moody woodland photographs, don't get me wrong, but it's not the sort of photo I want to take, and it took moving here for me to discover that. I'd far rather photograph a beautiful day at the beach, turquoise water, white sand, vibrant sunrises and sunsets, verdant rainforests and beautiful river cascades, than autumn foliage in a woodland. I do photograph storms if they come my way, but I'm not driving 500 kilometres to get in front of one. So yes, moving to Australia from England was, I reckon, the making of me as a photographer. I should of course point out that I would never have moved here if taking better photographs was the main outcome I wanted. It's not like I make a living from it, but it's nice that it happened, and I do empathise with photographers who do not have such amazing scenery within easy reach of their home. I feel your pain. Every time I walk onto one of the stunning beaches here, miles of pristine coastlands stretching north and south, and nobody else in sight, I smiled to myself as I remember that edgy teenager in his black bomber jacket. Above all, I realise I'm a lucky chap, and I hope that my appreciation for that is evident in the photographs that I take.